Los Angeles, a sprawling metropolis of endless highways, glittering skylines, and dreams as vast as the ocean. By day, it was a city of ambition, alive with the hum of industry and the aspirations of millions. By night, it became something else entirely, a place of shadows, secrets, and stories whispered beneath the smog-choked moonlight. For years, the city's energy had been enough to keep the sleepless entertained. But lately, something was different. The streets buzzed with an almost imperceptible unease, like a violin string tuned just slightly too tight, ready to snap. It started small, as these things often do. Lights flickered in otherwise immaculate neighborhoods, leaving even the wealthiest residents fumbling in the dark. Traffic, the city's lifeblood, became more chaotic than usual, with inexplicable jams forming in the dead of night on streets that should have been deserted. Street performers began abandoning their usual cheerful routines for dissonant melodies, their faces blank, as if playing to an audience that no one else could see. To those attuned to the rhythm of Los Angeles, these events felt like a minor chord disrupting a familiar symphony. Among the millions moving through this uneasy city were 5 strangers, each living their lives in quiet anonymity, unaware that their paths would soon converge. Elena, a barista with a sharp tongue and sharper instincts, worked the night shift at a coffee shop in Echo Park. Her customers were a mix of exhausted screenwriters and insomniacs. But lately, her regulars had stopped coming. Instead, she noticed unfamiliar faces, people who seemed out of place, their eyes glassy and distant. They never ordered anything. They simply lingered, watching her. Miles away in a dilapidated apartment in Koreatown, Raj, a tech developer, scrolled through online forums late into the night. He was a skeptic by nature, always searching for logical explanations for the inexplicable. Yet even he couldn't ignore the mounting reports of strange phenomena. Streetlights blinking in cryptic sequences, GPS systems leading drivers to abandoned buildings, and a growing number of missing persons cases. To Raj, it seemed like the city itself was becoming unmoored from reality. At the same time, Harper, a struggling actress, found herself drawn to a peculiar graffiti mural that had appeared overnight in the Arts District. The mural depicted a twisted version of a Hollywood sign, the letters distorted and crumbling, with shadowy figures climbing up its skeletal remains. Beneath it were the words, "The city knows." Harper couldn't shake the feeling that the mural was meant for her. It wasn't just the chilling message. It was the way the figures in the painting seemed to shift when she looked away, as if they were watching her too. Not far from the bustling Venice boardwalk, Luis, a rideshare driver, had his own unsettling experience. His last fare of the night had been to an address that didn't exist. When he tried to contact the passenger, the app glitched, freezing his screen on an empty chat window. Moments later, a woman appeared in his rearview mirror, even though his car was locked. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "Drive," she whispered. Luis didn't stop driving until the sun rose, and by then, the woman was gone. And then there was Ava, a retired journalist turned conspiracy blogger who had been documenting these anomalies from her bungalow in Silver Lake. Her most recent post, "The City's Pulse is Off," had gone viral, drawing thousands of readers who shared their own tales of unease. Some claimed to hear voices whispering through their headphones while walking downtown. Others reported dreams of faceless crowds gathering under a blood-red sky. Ava thought she had seen it all during her years as a reporter, but even she couldn't make sense of what was happening. On a warm September night, their lives began to intersect. Elena's coffee shop went dark during her shift, the power outage leaving her stranded with a single, flickering candle. Across the city, Raj's computer froze, the forums he'd been reading replaced by a single message: "It's time to meet." Harper, on her way home from an audition, found herself inexplicably drawn to a small, nondescript theater on Melrose. Luis's phone pinged with a notification for a ride request, address unknown. And Ava received an anonymous email containing only a set of coordinates and the words, "You're not alone." By midnight, all 5 strangers found themselves standing in the same dimly lit parking lot beneath a rusting neon sign that read, "The Stardust." The theater had been abandoned for decades, its marquee missing letters like teeth in a decaying smile. As they exchanged wary glances, none of them could explain why they were there. "This has to be some kind of prank," Raj muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Harper hugged her arms to her chest, shivering despite the warm breeze. "Does anyone else feel watched?" Before anyone could respond, the theater's doors creaked open, spilling pale light onto the cracked pavement. A faint hum emanated from inside, a sound that seemed to burrow into their skulls. Against their better judgment, they stepped forward, drawn by a force none of them could resist. As the door closed behind them, the city outside seemed to exhale, its restless energy momentarily subdued. For the five strangers, however, their nightmare was just beginning. The interior of the Stardust was an eerie snapshot of another era, frozen in decay. Dust-coated velvet seats sprawled across the auditorium, while faded posters of long-forgotten films clung to the peeling walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Elena wrinkled her nose and muttered, "Why do I feel like we're in a bad horror movie?" Her sarcasm barely masked the unease bubbling beneath the surface. Ava, the most composed of the group, moved further inside, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a journalist's scrutiny. "This place is ancient," she said, her voice steady but low. "No one's supposed to be here, yet the power's on." She gestured toward the dim, flickering light bulbs overhead. They swayed gently, as though responding to a breeze that didn't exist. Raj stayed close to the door, his phone in hand, trying to text anyone, but the screen was stuck on the same static-filled error message. No service. He tapped it nervously. "This isn't normal. I don't know about you, but I'm leaving." He turned toward the exit, but as he reached for the handle, the door didn't budge. Panic rising, he pushed harder, his movements frantic. "It's locked." Harper stepped forward, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "Of course it is. They don't invite you to places like this just to let you leave." Her words hung in the stale air, deepening the silence that followed. Luis gave her a sharp look. "Who's they?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "You sound like you know something we don't." Before Harper could respond, a low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards and into their bones. The group instinctively moved closer together, their collective anxiety palpable. The hum grew louder, resolving into an unsettling melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was a song without lyrics, composed of discordant notes that evoked a profound sense of dread. Then the projector flickered to life. A beam of pale light shot across the room, illuminating a screen at the far end of the theater. The group turned to face it, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the floor. The screen displayed a grainy black-and-white image of a bustling Los Angeles street from decades ago. People strolled along the sidewalks, cars rolled by, and the city seemed alive with mundane activity. At first, it looked like nothing more than archival footage. But as the seconds ticked by, the group began to notice something deeply unsettling. The figures in the film weren't just moving, they were watching. Their eyes, impossibly sharp despite the low resolution, seemed to track the group's every movement. Elena gasped and took a step back. "Are they looking at us?" Ava's face was pale, her journalistic skepticism faltering. "It's a trick," she said, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. "It has to be some kind of projection gimmick. Someone's trying to mess with us." But as the film continued, the figures in the footage began to act out of sync with the scene. Pedestrians paused mid-step, turning their heads unnaturally toward the camera. One by one, they started pointing at the screen, at the group, at something unseen beyond the frame. Suddenly, the image changed. The grainy footage cut to a new scene, the interior of the very theater they stood in. The perspective was eerily familiar, as though filmed from where they were standing. Harper let out a small scream as the camera panned across the room, revealing not just their current positions, but also more. There were additional figures in the seats, dark, blurred shapes that hadn't been there moments before. Luis took a step back, his face ashen. "I'm done. I'm not sticking around to see what happens next." He made a break for the door, yanking on it with all his strength, but it refused to budge. Behind him, the hum intensified, the melody growing more dissonant, more aggressive. The group exchanged panicked glances, unsure of what to do. Then, as if on cue, the screen went dark, plunging the room into silence. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, ragged and uneven. But the quiet didn't last. A voice, calm yet chilling, echoed through the theater. "You are here because the city chose you. You cannot leave." "Not yet." The group froze, the weight of the words settling over them like a shroud. Elena broke the silence, her voice trembling. "What does that mean? Chose us for what?" No answer came, only the soft creak of the theater's ancient seats, as if something, or someone, was shifting in the darkness. They were no longer alone. The silence that followed the disembodied voice was suffocating, punctuated only by the faint hum of the projector as it powered down. For a moment, no one dared move or speak, as if any sound might summon something even worse than the ominous declaration they'd just heard. The group huddled together, their collective terror binding them tighter than any friendship ever could. Luis was the first to snap. "I'm not staying here another second," he said, his voice cracking as he stomped toward the nearest aisle. His flashlight cut through the dimness, revealing rows of torn seats and the occasional flicker of movement. Though he tried to convince himself it was just the light playing tricks. "There's got to be another way out of here." Ava followed, her journalistic instincts still fighting for control over her fear. "Wait, Luis, don't go alone. We need to stick together." She glanced back at the others, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out. There's always an explanation." But as they moved deeper into the theater, the room seemed to stretch unnaturally. The aisles elongated, the walls fading into shadow. It felt as if the theater itself was alive, shifting and reshaping itself to trap them. Raj muttered under his breath, "This place is wrong. It's like a bad dream." As the group pressed forward, Harper lingered behind, her eyes darting toward the seats. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think there's something sitting in the seats." The others stopped and turned toward her, their flashlights scanning the rows. At first, they saw nothing but emptiness. Then, one by one, dark shapes began to materialize in the beams of light. Vague, human-like figures slumped in the seats. Their forms were shrouded in shadow, indistinct and flickering like projections. Yet there was no mistaking their presence. Elena gasped, clutching Raj's arm. "What are they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figures didn't move, but their presence was oppressive, as if they were silently judging the intruders. The group's flashlights flickered, their beams faltering as though the light itself was being drained. Ava stepped forward, her heart pounding. She had to prove this was some elaborate prank or illusion. "This is just some weird installation," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She reached out toward one of the figures, her hand trembling as it neared the shadowy form. The moment her fingers grazed the air around it, a deafening screech tore through the theater, a sound so piercing that the group dropped to their knees, clutching their ears. The figures in the seats turned their heads in unison, their faces, or lack thereof, becoming horrifyingly clear. They had no features, just smooth, dark surfaces where eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. Yet somehow, they seemed to stare directly into the group's souls. Then the theater erupted into chaos. The shadowy figures rose from their seats, their movements jerky and unnatural. They advanced slowly but deliberately, their presence freezing the group in place. Raj screamed, "Run!" but his legs felt like they were wading through molasses. The group stumbled toward the stage at the front of the theater, the only area not yet claimed by the encroaching shadows. Harper tripped on a loose floorboard and fell, her flashlight spinning out of her hand. Luis and Ava turned back to help her, their fear overridden by sheer instinct. "Get up!" Luis shouted, hauling Harper to her feet. The three of them scrambled onto the stage, just as the shadows reached the front row of seats. The group huddled together, their breaths ragged and shallow. Elena, clutching her own flashlight, scanned the area desperately. "There has to be another way out," she said, her voice shaking. "There has to be." The stage creaked ominously beneath them, and for a moment, they feared it might collapse. Then, as if responding to Elena's plea, a hidden trapdoor at the center of the stage swung open with a loud thunk. A faint light emanated from below, casting long shadows that seemed to beckon them downward. Ava peered into the opening, her jaw tightening. "Do we really want to go down there?" she asked, her voice laced with dread. Raj, pale and trembling, nodded. "It's either that or..." He gestured toward the figures, who were now lining the edge of the stage, their featureless faces tilted in silent observation. Without another word, the group descended into the trapdoor, one by one, leaving behind the suffocating darkness of the theater above. As they climbed down the rusted metal ladder, the faint light grew brighter, illuminating what appeared to be an underground corridor lined with cracked tiles and strange, indecipherable markings etched into the walls. Harper whispered, "What is this place?" No one answered. The air was thick with the sense that they had traded one nightmare for another. The ladder creaked with every step, and the metallic clang of their shoes against the rungs echoed in the confined shaft. Each member of the group descended in silence, their breaths labored, their minds racing with unanswered questions. Luis was the first to reach the bottom, his flashlight beams slicing through the darkness of the corridor. The walls were damp, their surfaces slick with condensation, and faint carvings ran in jagged patterns along the tiles. They resembled writing, but the language was unrecognizable. "What is this place?" Harper asked again, her voice shaking as she reached the ground. She stepped aside to make room for the others, her eyes darting nervously at the markings on the walls. "I don't think we want to know," Raj muttered, following close behind. His gaze lingered on the carvings, a faint sense of déjà vu prickling at the edge of his consciousness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something similar before, though where or when eluded him. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, illuminated only by the dim light of their flashlights. A faint sound, a distant dripping, perhaps from a leaking pipe, echoed through the space, amplifying the eerie stillness. Ava took a deep breath, her journalistic instincts overriding her fear. "We need to document this," she said, pulling out her phone to record video. Luis gave her a sharp look. "Seriously? You think this is the time for a documentary? We need to find a way out." "Maybe this is the way out," Ava shot back. "Or maybe it's the key to understanding what's happening here. If we don't figure this out, we're just wandering blind." The group hesitated, their flashlights swiveling between the two directions of the corridor. Elena broke the stalemate. "We go left," she said firmly. "If this place has any logic to it, left should lead back toward the theater's entrance, or at least away from those things upstairs." They moved as a unit, their footsteps muffled by the damp floor. The air grew colder the farther they went, and the carvings on the walls became more elaborate. Some depicted strange, distorted figures, their limbs elongated and faces twisted in expressions of anguish. Others showed scenes of what looked like rituals, circles of shadowy figures surrounding a central object that glowed faintly in the carvings, as if alive. "What kind of place is this?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers traced one of the carvings, and she recoiled as a shock of cold shot through her hand. "Don't touch anything," Luis warned, his voice tight. "We don't know what's safe." As they pressed on, a new sound joined the faint, dripping, soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against metal. It was distant at first, but grew louder with each step. Raj froze, his flashlight beam trembling. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. They all stopped, the silence amplifying the sound. The tapping grew closer, accompanied by an intermittent scraping, like claws dragging across the walls. Luis turned, his flashlight aimed behind them, but the corridor stretched empty into the distance. "We need to move faster," he said, his voice barely masking his panic. The group quickened their pace, but the sound followed, growing louder and more erratic. Harper stumbled, nearly falling, and Ava caught her arm, pulling her upright. "Keep going," Ava urged, The walls around them seemed to shift, the carvings writhing as if alive. The distorted figures in the etchings twisted their heads, their empty eye sockets following the group's movements. "Is it just me?" Elena began, her voice cracking. "Or are these carvings changing?" "No, it's not just you," Raj replied, his voice tight with fear. He shone his flashlight on one of the walls, and the figures in the carving turned to face him, their mouths open in silent screams. He staggered backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. Ahead, the corridor widened into a circular chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal, its surface engraved with the same jagged symbols as the walls. On top of the pedestal rested a small, glowing object, a shard of crystal emitting a faint, pulsating light. "What is that?" Harper asked, her voice filled with both awe and terror. Before anyone could answer, the tapping and scraping reached the chamber's entrance. The group turned as one, their flashlights catching glimpses of movement in the shadows. Something, or several somethings, were approaching, their shapes shifting and unnatural. "Grab it!" Louise shouted, pointing at the crystal. "It might be our only way out." Ava hesitated for only a moment before rushing forward and snatching the shard from the pedestal. The moment her fingers closed around it, the chamber was flooded with blinding light, and the walls seemed to vibrate with an unearthly hum. The carvings twisted violently, their figures writhing in agony, and the approaching shapes screamed, a sound so piercing it felt as if the air itself was splitting. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light vanished, plunging them back into darkness. The shapes at the chamber's entrance were gone, leaving only silence behind. Ava held the shard tightly, its glow now faint but steady in her hand. "What just happened?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ava replied, her breathing heavy. "But I think it saved us." The group stood in the eerie stillness of the chamber, their hearts pounding, knowing that whatever lay ahead was far from over. The group lingered in the circular chamber, their breath shallow as they tried to process the surreal events unfolding around them. The glowing shard in Ava's hand seemed to hum faintly, a sound that wasn't audible but felt deep within their bones. It cast a soft, ethereal light, barely illuminating the walls, but enough to make the writhing carvings appear dormant. For the first time since entering the corridor, the oppressive silence was bearable, though tension still hung thick in the air. Luis took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on the shard. "Ava, are you okay?" "That thing, it's not normal." Ava nodded, though her expression was far from confident. "I'm fine, I think," she said, turning the shard over in her hands. Its glow pulsed faintly in rhythm with her heartbeat. "But this thing feels alive, like it's aware of me." Raj crossed his arms tightly, his eyes darting to the carvings. "Yeah, well, it might have saved us, but what if it's dangerous? We don't even know what it is. Dangerous or not, we don't have a choice," Elena said firmly, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "That thing stopped whatever was chasing us. If it's our only weapon, we're keeping it." Harper, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Did anyone else hear it?" Right before the light, something was whispering. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Harper's words unlocked a memory in each of them. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to swirl around the chamber as the shard lit up. The words were indistinct, like fragments of an alien language, but they carried an undeniable weight, a promise, or perhaps a threat. Luis shook his head as if to clear it. "Let's not get stuck here debating. We need to move. This chamber might be safe now, but I don't trust it to stay that way." They left the chamber cautiously, Ava clutching the shard like a lifeline. The corridor beyond was no less foreboding, but the carvings seemed less hostile, their figures now frozen in their grotesque poses. The tapping and scraping sounds had vanished, replaced by the steady drip of unseen water. Yet an oppressive feeling of being watched remained, as if the walls themselves were alive. The group walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, their flashlights cutting narrow paths through the darkness. The shard's light, though faint, seemed to illuminate things the flashlights could not. Faint trails on the floor, subtle shifts in the air, and occasionally fleeting shadows that danced just out of sight. Eventually, they came to a fork in the corridor. Two paths stretched into darkness, indistinguishable except for the faint glow emanating from the right-hand passage. "It's like the shard is leading us," Ava whispered, holding it out. Its light grew slightly brighter when pointed toward the glowing path. "Convenient," Raj said dryly, though his sarcasm couldn't mask his unease. "Or it's leading us into a trap." "We don't have much of a choice," Elena replied. "Better a glowing path than stumbling blind into more of those things." The group turned down the glowing path, their movements slow and deliberate. As they walked, the air grew warmer, and the faint whispering returned. Not the eerie, alien murmurs from before, but something more distinct. Words in English, though still fragmented. "Protect complete the cost?" Ava stopped abruptly, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to the others. "It's speaking to me." "What's it saying?" Luis asked, his voice tense. "Something about protection," Ava replied, clutching the shard tighter. "In a cost. I don't understand." The corridor ended abruptly in another chamber, smaller than the first but more ornate. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of sacrifice, struggle, and triumph. At the center stood a statue of a robed figure holding a replica of the shard. Its face was featureless, yet its presence exuded authority. The whispers grew louder as the group entered, filling the room with an almost deafening hum. Ava staggered, the shard glowing brighter in her hands. "It's too much," she gasped, falling to her knees. Luis knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "Ava, stay with us." "What's happening?" The shard's light flared, filling the chamber with a blinding brilliance. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, booming voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You are chosen. The path begins here." When the light faded, the group found themselves no longer in the chamber, but in a vast, open expanse, a cityscape eerily similar to Los Angeles, but twisted and decayed. The buildings loomed at impossible angles, their windows glowing with an unnatural light. The sky was a swirling mass of black and red, and the air buzzed with an electric charge. "What is this?" Harper whispered, her voice trembling. Ava looked at the shard, its light now steady and piercing. "I think we've crossed into wherever this thing comes from." As the group stood in stunned silence, a low growl echoed from the shadows of the distorted city. They weren't alone, in whatever awaited them. The shard's cryptic promise of protection and cost would soon reveal its true meaning. The alien city pulsed with an eerie vitality, its decayed facade shimmering faintly under the unnatural sky. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of burnt metal and something sickly sweet. Ava clutched the shard tighter, its glow the only thing anchoring the group amidst the surreal chaos. Every step forward seemed to take more effort, as though the ground itself resisted them. "We need to keep moving," Elena urged, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Standing here won't help us figure out what the hell is going on." "Figure it out?" Raj said, his voice sharp with barely contained panic. "We're in a nightmare. There's no figuring this out." Despite his words, they moved forward, drawn inexorably toward a towering spire in the distance. The structure twisted upward like a gnarled tree, its surface dotted with pulsating lights that seemed to blink in rhythm with Ava's shard. Around them, the city shifted subtly, the shadows elongating and shifting without any apparent source of light. As they walked, the faint whispering returned, growing stronger with each step. The voices were no longer fragmented but coherent, speaking directly to Ava. "They watch," the shard seemed to say. "They hunger. They will test your worth." Ava halted abruptly, her face pale. "It's warning me. It says we're being watched." Harper froze, her eyes scanning the warped skyline. "Watched by what?" The answer came in the form of a sudden, guttural growl that reverberated through the air. From an alleyway ahead, a figure emerged. At first glance, it appeared human, a tall, wiry man in a tattered suit. But as it stepped into the shard's glow, its true form became evident. Its skin was translucent, revealing sinewy muscles and black veins pulsating beneath the surface. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth was filled with jagged, irregular teeth. Luis raised the metal rod he had picked up earlier, his hands trembling. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice betrayed his fear. The creature cocked its head, as though studying them, before letting out a chilling scream that echoed through the city. The group barely had time to react before it lunged, moving within human speed. Ava instinctively raised the shard, its light flaring brilliantly. The creature recoiled, shrieking as smoke rose from its flesh. "It's afraid of the light," Elena yelled. "Ava, keep it steady." The group circled around Ava as she held the shard high, its glow pushing the creature back into the shadows. But as it retreated, more growls sounded from the surrounding alleys. Shapes began to emerge, dozens of them, all with the same translucent skin and empty eyes. The city was alive with their howls, the sound rising to an unbearable crescendo. "We can't fight them all," Luis shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "We need to run." "But where?" Harper cried, her eyes wide with terror. Ava's gaze locked on the spire in the distance. The shard pulsed brighter when she looked at it, as if urging her forward. "That way," she yelled. "The shard wants us to go there." The group sprinted through the twisted streets, the shard's light cutting a narrow path through the encroaching darkness. The creatures pursued relentlessly, their screeches filling the air. Buildings seemed to lean closer, their warped facades reaching out as though trying to trap them. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, shifting with every step. As they neared the spire, the air grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. A massive archway loomed ahead, its surface covered in the same writhing carvings they had seen in the tunnels. The shard's light illuminated an inscription above the arch, written in a language none of them recognized, but which Ava somehow understood. "Only the worthy may ascend." Without hesitation, Ava stepped forward, the shard in her hand glowing so brightly it cast harsh shadows against the archway. The creatures halted abruptly at the edge of the light, their howls turning into guttural growls of frustration. It was as though an invisible barrier held them back. "Go!" Ava shouted, beckoning the others through the archway. One by one, they stumbled through, their breath coming in ragged gasps. As soon as the last of them crossed, the archway shimmered and sealed itself with a burst of light. The creature's shrieks of rage faded into silence. Inside, the air was still and cold, the oppressive weight of the city replaced by an eerie calm. The interior of the spire was vast and cathedral-like, its walls lined with more carvings that seemed to shift and writhe when looked at directly. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, its surface engraved with symbols that glowed faintly. The shard in Ava's hand pulsed, its light dimming slightly as though conserving energy. "This place," she whispered. "It's connected to the shard. I can feel it." "What now?" Raj asked, his voice shaky. Before anyone could answer, the pedestal began to hum, and a voice filled the chamber. Not the disjointed whispers they had heard before, but a single, commanding presence. "You have passed the first trial, but the path ahead is fraught with peril. Prepare yourselves." The group exchanged nervous glances. The pedestal's glow intensified, casting the room in a harsh, white light. They could only watch in stunned silence as the floor beneath them began to shift, forming a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. Whatever awaited them below, they knew there was no turning back. The spiraling staircase seemed endless, its descent marked only by the faint glow of Ava's shard and the cold, rhythmic hum emanating from the walls. Each step echoed loudly in the silence, a reminder of how far removed they were from the world above. The air grew colder and thinner as they descended, and the walls shifted, revealing intricate carvings that seemed to writhe like living organisms. "Why do I feel like this is only getting worse?" Raj muttered, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "It's not a feeling," Harper replied, her hand gripping the staircase's railing tightly. "It's a fact." As they continued, Ava's shard began to pulse again, its rhythm more erratic this time, like a heartbeat quickened by fear. "It's reacting to something," Ava said, holding it out in front of her. The light intensified, illuminating the steps ahead and revealing that the staircase ended in a wide, circular chamber below. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. At its center stood a large black monolith, its surface unervingly smooth and reflective. The monolith radiated a cold energy, sending shivers through the group as they approached. Around its base were 6 empty pedestals, each adorned with a different symbol that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. "What is this place?" Elena asked, her voice hushed, as if speaking louder would disturb the air. Before anyone could answer, the chamber trembled, and the monolith began to glow faintly. A deep, resonant voice filled the space, its tone neither human nor mechanical. "You have reached the second gate. Each of you must prove your worth. Only those who succeed will proceed." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Luis took a step back, his face pale. "Prove our worth? What does that even mean?" In response, the symbols on the pedestals flared to life, each casting a beam of light toward a different person. The beams enveloped them, and in an instant, they were separated, each transported to a different part of the chamber. Ava could no longer see the others, the world around her reduced to a dark void illuminated only by the shard in her hand. A voice echoed in her mind, softer and more familiar now. "Ava, your trial begins. Do not fail." Before she could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a reflection of herself, but this Ava was bruised, battered, and defeated. Her clothes were torn, her eyes hollow, and she moved with a weary gait. "You think you're strong," the reflection said, its voice a distorted version of her own. "But strength isn't in surviving. It's in facing the truth you've buried." "What truth?" Ava asked, her voice trembling. Her reflection's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You know what you've done. The people you left behind. The lies you told to get here. You think this shard chose you for no reason." Ava felt a surge of guilt and anger, memories flashing unbidden in her mind. Faces of people she'd betrayed, opportunities she'd taken at others' expense. She clenched the shard tightly, its warmth a small comfort. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. The reflection laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "There's always a choice. The question is, will you admit it?" The shard pulsed in her hand, its light growing stronger. Ava took a deep breath and stepped forward, confronting the reflection. "Yes," she said firmly. "I've made mistakes. I've hurt people. But I'm here now, and I'm not running anymore." The reflection paused, its cruel smile fading. "Then prove it," it said, before dissolving into light. The void around Ava began to dissolve as well, the chamber and her friends slowly coming back into view. One by one, the others reappeared, each looking shaken but alive. Luis was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. What the hell was that?" "A test," Harper replied, her usual sharpness replaced with unease. "But I don't know if we passed or failed." The monolith flared again, the voice returning. "The trials are not yet complete. Continue forward, if you dare." The group exchanged uneasy glances but knew there was no turning back. The chamber shifted, the monolith sinking into the ground as another staircase revealed itself, leading deeper into the unknown. Ava tightened her grip on the shard and led the way, her resolve solidifying despite the fear gnawing at her edges. Whatever lay ahead, she was determined to face it head-on. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a grand hall unlike anything they had encountered before. The walls, ceiling, and even the floor were lined with mirrors of various shapes and sizes. Some were tall and imposing, framed in ornate gold, while others were cracked and dusty, their glass clouded with age. The air was heavy with a strange energy that made their skin prickle, and the faint sound of whispers echoed through the chamber, though the source was nowhere to be seen. Harper was the first to speak, her voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "Why do I feel like we're being watched?" Luis scanned the room, his fingers twitching at his sides. Because we probably are. Ava stepped forward, holding the shard aloft. Its light refracted in the mirrors, casting fragmented beams that illuminated parts of the room. Yet the reflections didn't behave as they should. In some mirrors, their faces were distorted or missing altogether. In others, they saw versions of themselves performing actions they didn't remember, laughing, crying, or walking away from the group entirely. "This is wrong," Elena murmured, stopping to stare at one mirror that showed her alone in a dark forest, screaming for help. She tore her gaze away, shaking her head. "We need to keep moving." As they pressed on, the whispers grew louder, and the reflections more unsettling. Ava caught sight of one mirror where her reflection wasn't her own, but a shadowy figure that mimicked her movements, its eyes glowing faintly. She blinked, and it was gone. "Do you think these are warnings?" Raj asked, pointing to a mirror where his reflection stood with blood on its hands, staring blankly at the group. "Or something worse? Does it matter?" Harper snapped. "Whatever this place is, it's trying to mess with our heads. Don't look at the mirrors, just focus on getting to the other side." The words were easier said than done. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly, and with every step, the mirror's images became more vivid, more alive. In one, Luis watched as his reflection turned its back on the group and disappeared into the shadows. In another, Ava saw a child version of herself, clutching the shard and crying out for someone she couldn't name. Then came the voices. At first, they were indistinct murmurs, but as the group moved deeper into the hall, they began to take shape, familiar voices calling their names. "Ava," one voice whispered, soft and mournful. She froze in place, recognizing it immediately. It was her mother's voice, gone now for years. She turned instinctively, her breath hitching as she saw her mother's face in one of the mirrors. "Ava, why didn't you come back?" the reflection asked, its tone accusatory. Ava felt a lump rise in her throat, her grip on the shard loosening. "Ava, don't," Harper barked, grabbing her shoulder and pulling her away. "It's not real." "It feels real," Ava replied, her voice shaking. "It's her? I don't. It's not her." Harper's sharp tone cut through the haze, grounding Ava just enough to step back from the mirror. The reflection of her mother vanished, replaced by Ava's own tired face staring back at her. But the hall wasn't finished with them. One by one, the others were drawn into their own mirrors, their faces pale as they watched their darkest fears and regrets play out before them. Elena collapsed to her knees in front of a mirror where she saw herself as an old woman, alone and forgotten. Raj smashed one of the mirrors with his fist, shouting at the image of his father, who berated him for never being good enough. The glass shattered, but the reflection remained, laughing at him from the shards. The group was unraveling, and Ava knew it. She raised the shard high above her head, its light growing brighter. "Stop," she shouted, her voice echoing through the chamber. The mirrors quivered, their images distorting. The voices fell silent, replaced by a deep, guttural hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The shard pulsed violently, its light exploding outward. The mirrors cracked and shattered all at once, the sound deafening. When the light faded, the hall was empty, its walls bare. The group stood in the silence, breathing heavily, their reflections gone. "What just happened?" Luis asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ava lowered the shard, its glow dimming. "I don't know, but whatever this place is, it knows us. It knows our fears, our regrets, everything we've tried to bury." Harper nodded grimly, her usual sarcasm replaced by something heavier. "And it's only going to get worse." They regrouped and continued forward, their steps more cautious now. The hall opened into another passageway, but the whispers lingered in their minds, a reminder of what they had faced and what they might face next. The corridor narrowed before opening into a grand, yet decrepit theater. Dust-covered chandeliers hung precariously from the high ceiling, their crystals tinkling softly in the faint draft that filtered through the broken walls. Rows of plush red seats, long faded to a dull maroon, stretched out toward a stage framed by decayed velvet curtains. Despite its abandoned state, the theater felt alive, a low hum vibrating through the air. "This wasn't on the map," Raj muttered, glancing nervously at the stage. "Was it?" Ava shook her head, the shard pulsing faintly in her hand as if reacting to the space. "No, but I think we're meant to be here." Harper snorted, crossing her arms. "Oh great, we're following the logic of creepy ghost stories now. Next, you'll tell me we're supposed to sit down and wait for a show." As if on cue, the lights flickered on. Not the dim, erratic glow they had come to expect from this strange labyrinth, but a warm, golden light that bathed the room in an eerie semblance of life. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats as the chandeliers steadied, casting perfect, shimmering reflections across the walls. The curtains on the stage began to part slowly, their movement accompanied by the groaning of old mechanisms. Behind them, the stage revealed itself, not empty, but occupied. 6 mannequins stood in lifelike poses, dressed in elegant, vintage attire. Their painted faces were frozen in expressions of joy, sorrow, and anger. "Okay, that's unsettling," Elena whispered, stepping closer to Ava. "What are they supposed to be?" The mannequins moved. It was subtle at first, a slight tilt of a head, a faint twitch of a hand. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, they began to shuffle across the stage. Their movements were jerky yet purposeful, mimicking a pantomime of some long-forgotten play. The group watched in horrified fascination as the mannequins reenacted a scene of apparent betrayal. A lover spurned, a duel fought, and a tragic fall. Luis backed away, shaking his head. "No, no way. We're not staying here." But as he turned to leave, the theater doors slammed shut with a thunderous boom, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. The mannequins froze mid-motion, their heads snapping in unison to face the group. Their lifeless eyes seemed to burn with a newfound intensity, pinning the intruders in place. "What do we do?" Elena hissed, her voice trembling. "We can't fight them, they're just things, right?" Ava held up the shard, its glow faltering as if diminished by the oppressive atmosphere. "I think they're watching us, waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Raj demanded, his voice rising. "For us to die? For us to join them?" Before anyone could respond, a spotlight beamed down on the group, blindingly bright. A disembodied voice filled the theater, smooth and theatrical, yet dripping with malice. "The audience has arrived. Let the next act begin." The mannequins moved again, this time descending the stage with unnatural speed. The group scattered, diving into the rows of seats for cover. Harper knocked over a chair in a rush, the noise echoing like a gunshot. One of the mannequins twisted its head toward her, its painted smile widening unnaturally. "They're coming for us?" Harper yelled, grabbing a broken chair leg as a makeshift weapon. She swung at the mannequin as it lunged for her, its porcelain face shattering on impact. But where it fell, another took its place, its hand reaching out with inhuman strength. Ava darted toward the stage, her instincts screaming that the shard was the key. She leapt onto the creaking wood, dodging another mannequin as it clawed at her. At the center of the stage was an ornate pedestal, its surface carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The shard pulsed in her hand, pulling her toward it. "Ava!" Elena shouted, struggling to fend off 2 mannequins. "What are you doing?" "I think this is it," Ava cried, slamming the shard onto the pedestal. The symbols lit up instantly, emitting a piercing light that engulfed the room. The mannequins froze mid-attack, their bodies crumbling into ash. The oppressive energy in the theater dissipated, leaving only silence. The group regrouped on the stage, their faces pale and drawn. The shard's glow had dimmed to almost nothing, but its warmth remained. Ava picked it up, her hands trembling. "What was that?" Raj asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Ava admitted, her eyes scanning the empty theater. "But whatever it was, it's not over. This place isn't just testing us. It's trying to break us." The theater lights flickered once before extinguishing completely, plunging them into darkness once more. The theater was silent, unnervingly so, and the lingering stench of dust and decay filled the air. The group remained huddled together, still reeling from their encounter with the mannequins. Each step felt heavy, as if the very floor beneath them was aware of their presence. Ava tightened her grip on the shard, which now felt unusually cold, its glow barely a faint shimmer. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the silence was merely a prelude to something worse. "We need to keep moving," Luis said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and strained, as if speaking louder would somehow draw the attention of whatever force haunted the place. "It's not safe here," Ava nodded, but the feeling of dread had settled deep within her bones. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but she knew that staying in this room any longer would only deepen the sense of suffocation that gripped them all. They turned away from the stage, and the moment they stepped off the wooden boards, the floor shifted beneath them. The walls groaned and creaked, as if alive, and with a sudden, violent tremor, the room began to change. The floor split apart, revealing a yawning abyss below. A thick fog poured from the widening gap, obscuring their vision. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire world was spinning out of control. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the transformation halted, and a new path emerged. It was not the same theater they had just left behind. They found themselves at the entrance of a labyrinth, a vast, twisting maze that stretched into the darkness. The walls were lined with mirrors, similar to the ones in the Hall of Mirrors, and the air smelled damp and stale. The oppressive hum from earlier had returned, this time louder, as though 1,000 voices were whispering at once, but none of the words could be discerned. "Great," Harper muttered. "Another maze. Just what we needed. Do you think it's real?" Elena asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I mean, this place, it keeps shifting. Nothing makes sense." Ava could only shake her head. "I don't know, but we have no choice but to try and get through." Raj took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the walls as if to steady himself. "Let's move quickly. The longer we stay, the more likely we are to get lost. Or worse." The group moved cautiously through the maze, each turn and corridor more disorienting than the last. The mirrors reflected distorted versions of themselves, their faces twisted into grotesque shapes, some smiling in sinister ways while others appeared to scream silently. The sounds of the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in around them. "This is insane," Luis said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Why can't we just find an exit? Every time we think we're getting closer to the end, we're right back where we started." Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the feeling all too well. They were trapped, but more than that, it felt like something was deliberately playing with them. The maze wasn't just a physical challenge. It was an emotional one, a test of their very sanity. And then, just as they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a mirror that was unlike the others. It was larger, almost imposing, framed in tarnished silver. Its surface was smooth, without a single crack. At first, it showed only the reflection of the group, standing still and uncertain. But as Ava took a step forward, the reflection shifted. It wasn't them anymore. In the mirror, their faces were replaced by shadows, dark figures that bore no resemblance to the people they had once been. The figures in the glass moved, stepping out of the frame and into the maze. The real group stood frozen as the mirror versions advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though something was controlling them from within. "Move!" Ava shouted, her voice frantic. She grabbed Raj's arm, pulling him away from the mirror, but the others seemed rooted to the spot, their eyes locked on the glass. Luis finally broke free, swearing under his breath as he dragged Harper back. "Come on, we need to get out of here now." The sound of footsteps grew louder. The mirror versions were closing in on them. As if on cue, the maze shifted once again. The walls realigned, cutting off their escape route. The space was shrinking, and the whispers turned into voices, actual words now, calling their names, beckoning them towards something terrible. "What do we do?" Elena whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "How do we stop this?" Ava's mind raced. The shard. It had to be the key, but as she turned to look at it, she realized that it was no longer in her hand. She scanned the ground frantically, her heart sinking. The shard was gone. "No, no, no," she whispered, panic seizing her chest. The walls continued to close in, the labyrinth's grip tightening around them. Raj reached into his jacket pocket, his eyes wide with panic. What if we break the mirror?" he suggested, though his voice was uncertain. Without another word, Harper stepped forward, grabbing the nearest shard of broken glass from the floor. She swung it at the mirror, and the glass shattered with a deafening crash. But as it did, something unexpected happened. The shards dissolved into the air, vanishing like smoke. The maze stopped shifting. The walls stopped closing. The whispers faded. The group stood, breathing heavily in the sudden silence. But Ava knew they hadn't escaped. Not really. This place, whatever it was alive, and it wouldn't stop until it had broken them completely. "Keep moving," Ava said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "We're not out of it yet." The maze had not relented. Even after the shattering of the mirror, the labyrinth seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if it could not be satisfied with just the disintegration of its reflections. Ava could feel its cold, unfathomable reach, the walls pressing in tighter with each step. It was no longer just the sound of whispers. There was a sense of presence now, something intangible yet undeniably close, lurking at the periphery of her thoughts. "Where are we going?" Luis asked, his voice hollow, as though even the air had thickened around them. "Forward," Ava replied sharply, her eyes darting from one turn to the next. She had no idea where they were headed. The maze defied any logic or sense of direction. Every corner they turned led to a dead end, only for the walls to reconfigure themselves in a continuous loop. It felt as though the labyrinth was feeding off their growing confusion, growing stronger the more lost they became. The maze had taken on an even more unnerving quality, its shifting structure no longer a mere inconvenience, but a malevolent force in itself. The walls were now etched with strange symbols, unrecognizable yet familiar in a way that gnawed at the edges of Ava's mind. The mirrors were gone, but the reflections remained, distorted in the shadows, in the corners of her vision, always shifting, never quite still. "Do you see that?" Elena whispered. Her voice trembled as she pointed toward a darkened stretch of hallway. In the distance, there were figures, unmoving, almost statuesque in their stillness. At first, they appeared to be human, their bodies indistinguishable from those of real people. But as they came closer, their inhumanity became apparent. Their skin was pale, unnaturally so, and their eyes were black, voids of darkness, like hollow sockets. Ava's heart sank as she realized what they were. "The Hollow Ones," she muttered under her breath, recalling the tales that had surfaced throughout their journey. They were creatures born of the maze, nothing more than empty vessels meant to torment those who dared enter. Unlike the mannequins, these beings were not mere figures. They were alive in some twisted sense, animated by the dark energy of the place itself. They had no voices, no true essence of self, just the hollow echo of something once human, twisted by the curse that lay within this infernal maze. "They're watching us," Raj whispered, his gaze fixed on the figures. Ava nodded, her stomach turning. She had seen them in the depths of the mirrors before, but now they were real, too real. And the worst part? They weren't alone. The more she looked, the more she realized that these figures were multiplying. Every corner seemed to birth another, their eyes following her every move, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they inched closer, like marionettes with invisible strings. "Don't let them touch you," she said urgently, her voice rising. "Whatever you do, don't let them touch you." But it was already too late. One of the Hollow Ones had started to move, its limbs creaking as it advanced toward them. There was no sound, no footsteps, just the cold, oppressive presence of its slow, deliberate approach. The group instinctively backed away, but the maze shifted again, blocking their path and forcing them into the open. "We need to run," Luis shouted, his face a mask of fear. But where could they run? There was no way out. The walls were closing in again, the labyrinth responding to their panic. The hollow ones, like shadows in the night, kept coming, their black eyes never blinking, never wavering. Ava's pulse quickened, and she turned, desperate for an escape. But the maze was shifting faster now, with walls sliding into place, locking down every potential route they had once hoped to take. The creatures were almost upon them, their cold, empty eyes focused on their prey, their movements becoming faster, more deliberate. In the chaos, something shifted, a sound, faint at first, like a distant hum or a low whisper, cut through the silence. It was coming from the walls themselves, vibrating with energy, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. Something dark was being awakened, something far worse than the hollow ones. Ava clenched her fists, trying to block out the fear that threatened to swallow her. There was no choice now. They had to fight, not just for survival, but for the chance to escape whatever twisted reality this maze had become. "Hold your ground," she yelled, though she could barely hear her own voice over the rising hum of the walls. She drew the shard again, the faint glow a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. It was her only weapon, her only hope, and as the hollow ones closed in, she thrust it forward, as if it could sever the very fabric of this nightmare. The shard flared brightly, its light spreading across the maze, and the hum grew louder, more insistent. For a moment, it felt as though the walls were shaking, as though the very foundation of the maze was quaking beneath them. The hollow ones hesitated, their movements faltering as if something was pulling at their essence. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the creatures stopped. The labyrinth was silent once more, the walls still, and the air thick with the lingering remnants of fear. But Ava knew better than to think they were free. The maze was not done with them yet. The hollow ones had been a distraction, a test, but whatever force had created this place was still watching, still waiting. "We need to find the center," Ava said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her veins. "It's the only way out. We have to get to the heart of this maze." Luis looked at her, his face pale but determined. "And how do we do that?" Ava didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing: they couldn't stop now. If they did, the maze would consume them. They had to keep moving forward, even as the darkness pressed in on them from all sides. "We keep moving," she said, her resolve hardening, "and we find the heart." The air in the maze had grown thick and oppressive, the kind of stifling humidity that clung to your skin, making every breath feel like it had to be forced through a narrow, suffocating passage. Ava led the group through what seemed like a never-ending series of hallways. With every turn, it became increasingly clear that the labyrinth was no longer merely a physical space. It was alive, shifting, pulsing with an unseen rhythm. It was as if the walls themselves had a heartbeat, one that thrummed beneath their feet, syncing with the frantic pace of their thoughts. Luis's hand brushed the wall as they moved forward, his face scrunching in confusion. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice low, almost unsure of what he was even asking. This isn't like before. It's different. It feels elusive." Ava finished for him. She glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his with a look of growing dread. "It's evolving. The maze is evolving." The walls, once smooth and unyielding, had become jagged, their surfaces now covered in strange, shifting markings. They seemed to pulse and writhe like living things, as though something was trying to break free from within. The pulse was undeniable, reverberating through the stone, making the ground tremble beneath their feet. It was unnerving, like the maze itself was aware of their presence, and it wasn't content with simply trapping them. It was testing them, toying with their minds, pushing them further into the abyss. "We need to find the heart of this place." "Ava," Raj said, his voice tense as he tried to hide the panic rising in his chest. "If the walls are changing like this, we don't have much time before it's too late." Ava nodded, her hand gripping the shard she had kept with her. The only weapon they had left, the only thing that had shown any ability to affect the maze's twisted reality. She had no idea how the shard worked or why it had responded to the creatures in the last chapter of their journey. But something told her that its glow was tied to the strange pulse in the walls. The more the maze shifted, the stronger the shards seemed to resonate. But it wasn't just the pulse of the maze that was concerning. As they walked deeper into the labyrinth, the air grew colder, almost icy. It wasn't a simple drop in temperature. It was as if the atmosphere itself was draining warmth from their bodies, leaving them cold and shivering. Each breath seemed to fog up in front of them, dissipating quickly as if the very air was rejecting their existence. And then, as if the walls weren't enough to rattle their nerves, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, reached their ears. It was a low, vibrating hum that resonated from the very heart of the maze. For a brief moment, Ava thought it might be her mind playing tricks on her. But as she looked to the others, she saw the same look of confusion and fear reflected in their faces. They all heard it. The hum grew louder, building in intensity, and with it came a tremor in the ground, subtle but unmistakable. It was as if the maze was alive in a way they had not fully understood until now, its heart beating, pulling them toward its core. The walls seemed to stretch, elongating and contracting in time with the rhythm of the hum. And the more they walked, the more they realized they weren't just walking through a maze anymore. They were moving towards something that was calling them. "This isn't right," Elena muttered, her voice barely a whisper. She reached for her necklace, clutching it tightly as if grounding herself against the growing unease. The maze is not just playing with us anymore. It's trying to communicate. Ava's mind raced. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The maze was aware of them. It was responding to their every move, manipulating the environment around them, feeding off their fear and confusion. But why? And what was waiting for them at the heart of it all? As they moved forward, they stumbled upon a new section of the maze, one that felt different. The air was thicker here, heavier, as though they had crossed an invisible threshold. The walls, now covered in intricate symbols, seemed to glow faintly in the dark, casting eerie shadows that shifted and flickered in the dim light. The symbols pulsed with a rhythmic intensity, synchronized with the hum that was still vibrating through the ground. It was almost hypnotic, a rhythm that seemed to pull at the edges of their sanity. Raj moved forward, his footsteps slow, cautious, as if he feared triggering something. "It's like a heartbeat," he murmured, eyes wide. "The heart of the maze. You think this is it?" Ava wasn't sure. She stepped forward, her heart racing, and the air seemed to close in around her. She could feel the maze pressing against her, challenging her every step. The closer they got to the center, the stronger the pulse became, until it was all-consuming, drowning out everything else. Her body felt heavy, like the pulse was dragging her down with it. It was then that the ground beneath them cracked open, a deep, resounding crack that shook the air and sent a shock of cold through their bodies. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze, like time itself had stopped. And then the center revealed itself. A cavernous void opened before them, an abyss of infinite blackness that seemed to swallow every ounce of light. It was a hollow, pulsating heart, a void that was both frightening and mesmerizing. The pulse of the maze, the heartbeat that had drawn them here, came from within it. Ava couldn't look away. It was as if the center of the maze had become an entity in itself, a sentient being that hungered for something, maybe for them, maybe for their souls. The hum was now deafening, filling her mind with a chorus of dissonant voices, whispers that clawed at her thoughts. It was an overwhelming sensation, a suffocating force, and she knew they had reached the point of no return. This was what the maze had been leading them to, an entrance to something far darker than they had ever imagined. "We can't stay here," Ava gasped, her voice strained as the pulse beat louder, vibrating deep within her chest. "We need to go, now." But it was too late. The ground trembled violently, the black abyss at the heart of the maze opening wider, and a chilling cold swept over them. The walls began to twist and warp, the maze no longer a simple construct of stone, but a living, breathing thing. And Ava understood then that they were not just trapped within it. They were part of it now. The heart of the maze had been awakened, and they were not going to escape. The pulse had become deafening, a sound that vibrated not just through the walls of the maze, but through the very fabric of reality itself. Ava, Raj, Luis, Elena, and the rest of the group found themselves caught in an overwhelming wave of sound and sensation that threatened to pull them into the very heart of the void. The cavernous opening before them was no longer just a space. It was alive, breathing, calling to them. Every step they took seemed to take them deeper into its grasp, as if the labyrinth had turned into an extension of the nightmare they were already living. It was as if time itself had fractured, broken apart, and each passing moment was a fragment of something larger, something more terrifying. The cold was unbearable now. It was a visceral chill that sank into their bones, numbing them from the inside out. But it wasn't just the physical cold that terrified them. It was the realization that they had become part of the labyrinth's design. They were no longer wandering aimlessly. They were being pulled towards something, a force that was beyond their comprehension. Raj's voice broke through the silence, a hoarse whisper barely audible above the crescendo of the pulse. "What is this place?" His words seemed to tremble with the weight of the question, a question they had all been asking but never dared to put into words. The maze was no longer just a puzzle. It was an organism, a living, breathing entity with a mind of its own. It wasn't just a trap, it was a consciousness. We're in its heart," Ava said, her voice distant and hollow. Her eyes were wide, fixated on the churning blackness in front of her. "This is where it begins. This is where it feeds." Luis, ever the skeptic, shook his head, his hands trembling as he clutched at his side. "That doesn't make sense. This can't be real. It can't be. We've been through worse, right? We've survived worse. We just need to." A chilling laugh, not human, echoed around them, causing every hair on their bodies to stand on end. The sound reverberated through the labyrinth, bouncing off the walls like a mocking taunt. Luis froze, his words dying in his throat as the laughter seemed to come from all directions, surrounding them, closing in on them. It was as if the very air itself had become alive, aware of their fear, and it fed on it. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the weight of the maze pressing against her. She could feel it, its intelligence, its awareness. It was watching them, studying them, learning their weaknesses. The maze was not just a physical space, but an entity that had been waiting for them, drawing them into its web, its grasp. "What does it want from us?" Elena whispered, her eyes wide with terror as she scanned the void, unable to understand what was happening. Her hands were clenched tightly in front of her, as though holding on to something invisible for protection. "I don't know," Ava responded, her voice shaky. "But I think it's feeding off us, off our fear. It's growing stronger." The pulse intensified once again, its rhythm matching the beating of their hearts. Every thud seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet, making their legs weak. The air was thick with a suffocating energy, as if the maze was drawing them in like a spider luring prey into its web. Raj, unable to stand the tension, moved forward, his hand trembling as it reached toward the shard Ava had been carrying. The shard had glowed faintly ever since they had found it, a beacon of hope in the otherwise oppressive darkness. But now, as Raj's fingers brushed against it, it flared to life, its glow bright and searing, cutting through the suffocating darkness. The maze responded immediately, the pulse growing erratic, almost frantic, as if it had been disturbed. "What's happening?" Luis exclaimed, stepping back as the walls around them began to shudder. "It's like the maze is reacting to it." Ava's heart raced as she watched the shard pulse in her hand. It was the only thing that had seemed to have any effect on the maze, but she wasn't sure if it was helping or making things worse. The walls around them began to bend and twist, warping in ways that defied logic. The blackness of the void seemed to be extending, growing outward, consuming the space they were in. They were being drawn into it, sucked toward its center, as if the maze was reaching out for them. "We have to get out of here," Raj shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Now!" But there was no escape. The walls were closing in. The pulse was too strong, too powerful. The ground shook violently, and suddenly, the world around them seemed to disintegrate. It wasn't a collapse. It was more like the world was being torn apart, it seems. The very fabric of reality felt like it was unraveling, and they were caught in the middle of it. Ava could feel the energy building, the power of the maze surging through the ground, through the air. The pulse was no longer just a sound. It was a force, a presence that seemed to reach into their minds, touching their very souls. It was pulling them closer to the heart of the maze, deeper into its embrace. And she knew, deep down, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that they were no longer in control of their fate. In the midst of the chaos, a single thought broke through Ava's mind. This is what it wants. We are the offering. The realization hit her with a brutal clarity. The maze had been guiding them, manipulating their every move, pulling them closer and closer to the point where it would consume them. It was too late. There was no escape. The pulse reached its peak, and the walls of the labyrinth began to collapse inward. The world around them twisted, warped, and then everything went black. And in the darkness, the heart of the maze pulsed one final time. When Ava opened her eyes, the world was no longer familiar. The blackness that had consumed them had given way to an eerie, unnatural stillness. For a moment, she thought she might be dead, that the maze had finally claimed them all. But the sharp sting of cold air against her skin and the faint tremor of her fingers told her that wasn't the case. She wasn't dead. She was somewhere else. The others were scattered around her, disoriented and gasping for breath, as though they, too, had just awakened from some nightmarish dream. Raj was the first to stir, his hands reaching up as though feeling for some invisible anchor to the ground. Luis' voice broke the silence, hoarse and ragged. What just happened? Where are we? Ava slowly pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, her mind still reeling. The sensation of the pulse, of that overwhelming force that had seemed to tear apart reality itself, lingered in her bones. It was as if she could still feel it, coursing through her, gnawing at her from the inside out. She looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The place they were in felt wrong. There were no walls, no labyrinth, no oppressive weight pressing down on them. Instead, there was only a vast, empty void, a space that stretched infinitely in every direction. The ground beneath them was solid, but it had the same strange, metallic sheen as the labyrinth itself. It was neither entirely familiar nor entirely alien, like a place between worlds. "Elena?" Ava called out, her voice cracking slightly as she scanned the void. Elena was the last to stand, her movements slow and unsure. She looked up, her expression blank, her eyes wide with confusion. What happened? Elena's voice was distant, her words empty of emotion, as if she couldn't grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Ava replied, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "But I think we're still in the maze. It's just different now." Raj staggered toward Ava, his expression one of utter disbelief. "But we got out, didn't we? I thought we were done." The walls were falling apart. The maze was collapsing. How are we still here? Ava didn't have an answer. She had no explanation for what had just happened. One moment they had been trapped, caught in the pulse of the maze, and the next this. She had never felt so lost, so utterly disconnected from everything she knew. The maze had been real, had been something they could touch and feel, something tangible and oppressive. But now they were suspended in some liminal space, cut off from reality. The rules had changed, and they had no idea how to survive in this new place. A soft, unnerving sound broke through the silence, a low hum that reverberated through the air like an electric charge. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, building in intensity until it was nearly deafening. It was the same pulse they had heard before, but now it was distant, almost as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth, or perhaps from beyond it. Ava looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing but an endless stretch of empty space. "What is that?" she whispered, dread creeping up her spine. "It's the maze," Luis said, his voice thick with fear. "It's still alive. We never left." The reality of what he was saying hit Ava like a punch to the gut. The maze hadn't been destroyed. It had been merely reshaped, reborn into something else entirely. It had followed them here, to this place, this empty void between worlds. They had escaped one trap only to find themselves caught in another. Ava's thoughts raced as she tried to process everything. The maze had always felt like a living thing, an intelligence that was beyond their understanding. But now it was clear, it wasn't just a physical maze, it was a consciousness. And that consciousness had reached out, ensnaring them, pulling them into a place where they could never escape. Every step they took, every breath they drew, was feeding it, nourishing it, giving it more power. The group huddled together, each of them processing their own growing terror. The pulse was louder now, almost overwhelming, as though the very air around them was vibrating with its power. It was no longer something they could run from. They had to confront it. But how? Ava turned toward the others, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. We need to find the source of this. We need to confront it. Now, before it takes any more from us. But how? Raj asked, his voice shaky with uncertainty. What can we do? We don't even know what this place is, let alone how to destroy it. Ava hesitated, glancing around at the empty void, trying to discern some hint of direction. The walls of the labyrinth had once offered them a sense of purpose, a direction, even if it was one that led them into danger. Now, there was only emptiness, only the suffocating pulse of the maze and the vague, unsettling sense that they were being watched. We don't have a choice, she said finally. We have to keep moving forward. We have to find the heart of this place, the source of the pulse, and end it. But as she said the words, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling deep inside her. There was no escape, no way out. They had been chosen, brought here for a reason, just as they had been chosen to enter the maze in the first place. Louise's voice broke through her thoughts. We need to stick together. Whatever's happening, it's not over. This place, it's changing us, changing all of us. And as he spoke, Ava realized the truth of his words. They weren't the same people who had entered the maze days, maybe weeks ago. The maze had already altered them, had already begun to take its toll. Their fear, their desperation, their pain, it was all feeding into the pulse, strengthening the very force that had captured them. And if they didn't act soon, if they didn't find a way to destroy it, the price would be more than any of them could bear. As Ava, Raj, Luis, and Elena moved deeper into the strange, void-like space, they began to sense something more than the oppressive hum of the maze's pulse. It was as if the very air around them was alive, shifting in response to their every movement, drawing closer with each step. The emptiness felt less like an absence and more like a presence, something that was aware of them, watching them as they stumbled through the alien terrain. They couldn't see it, but they could feel it creeping closer, wrapping around them like a tightening noose. The fear that had once been an abstract concept was now tangible, an entity of its own that gnawed at their minds and hearts. Ava felt a tightening in her chest as she moved forward, her steps growing more labored with each passing second. She glanced back at the others, their faces pale with terror, their eyes wide, as if they too could sense the invisible force that pressed in on them. It was suffocating, the air thick with something unnameable, something that wasn't natural. And though they had moved into what seemed like an open space, they were more trapped than ever before. The pulse had slowed somewhat, but it had not disappeared. Instead, it had settled into the background, a constant, vibrating presence that resonated deep within their bones. It was a quiet hum now, but its power was undeniable. It was as though the pulse had become a living thing, pulsing with a rhythm of its own, aware of their every move. Ava wondered if it had always been this way, if the pulse had been controlling them from the very beginning. Had they ever truly been free? I think it's changing us, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. The maze is not just physical, it's inside us. I feel it. Ava turned to face Elena, her brow furrowed. Elena's eyes were wide, unfocused, as if she were seeing something that wasn't there. What do you mean? What's happening to you? I don't know, Elena said, her voice breaking. But something's wrong. I'm seeing things that aren't real. Shadows, shapes. I think they're watching me. Ava's stomach churned at Elena's words. It was as though the labyrinth had reached into their minds, weaving its presence into their thoughts, their perceptions of reality. The maze had always been a physical thing, something they could touch and feel, something they could escape from. But now it was something more. It was inside them, influencing their thoughts, shaping their fears. Luis let out a sharp gasp. "Did you hear that?" The others froze, their hearts racing in unison as they strained to hear. The hum of the pulse had faded, replaced by something else, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the ground beneath their feet. It was distant at first, almost inaudible, but it grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. Ava's pulse quickened. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. "It's not the maze," Raj muttered. "It's something else, something worse." Luis, who had been leading the group, turned sharply, his eyes wide with panic. "We need to move. Now!" They began to run, their feet slapping against the metallic surface of the ground. But it was no use. The growl grew louder, closer, as if it were right behind them. Ava could feel it like a heavy weight pressing on her back, chasing her, hunting her. The fear in her chest constricted, and for a moment, she thought she might not make it. She could hear the others' footsteps behind her, but it was becoming harder to distinguish their sounds from the ones that came from the void itself. In the distance, a shape began to form. At first, it was barely perceptible, a shadow, a flicker at the edge of her vision. But as it grew closer, Ava's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a shadow. It was something else, something alive, something monstrous. A creature made of shifting forms, its body constantly changing as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. Its growl reverberated through her bones, and she felt the terrifying pull of its presence, like gravity dragging her toward it. "Ava!" Raj's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to reality. "It's here!" Without thinking, she turned, running as fast as she could, but the creature was already too close. Its twisted form loomed behind her, the ground beneath her feet shaking with each step it took. The pulse of the maze was drowned out by the sound of its growls, and Ava could hear the others screaming, their voices a mix of fear and disbelief. She reached out, grabbing Elena's arm and pulling her forward. "Come on," Ava shouted. "We have to keep moving." But it was too late. The creature lunged, its body twisting and writhing as it closed the distance between them. Ava could feel its cold breath on the back of her neck, its presence closing in on her like a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The growl became deafening, and in the chaos, she lost track of the others. She couldn't see them, couldn't hear them anymore. All she could focus on was the creature, its eyes, its hunger, its overwhelming presence. Ava stumbled forward, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to the ground, and for a brief moment, she thought she had reached the end. But then, in the instant before the creature reached her, everything went black. She was falling, plummeting into a void that had no beginning and no end. The ground disappeared beneath her feet, and she felt weightless, suspended in the cold darkness. It was a brief, horrifying moment, one that stretched on for eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. She was back. But where? What was real? And what was illusion? As Ava slowly regained her bearings, she could feel the pull of the maze once again, stronger than before. And in that moment, she realized something. The creature wasn't just hunting them. It was feeding on their fear, their desperation. The maze had taught it how to manipulate them, how to twist their minds and hearts. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was a creation of their own fear, born from the depths of their darkest nightmares. And they couldn't run from it. It was inside them, with them, every step of the way. They were trapped. Ava's breath was shallow, her pulse racing, as she slowly stood up from the ground. The fall had shaken her, but it wasn't the physical impact that terrified her. It was the deep, gnawing realization that she wasn't just dealing with a physical threat. The creature, the fear, the maze itself, They were all interwoven in a way that she couldn't fully comprehend yet, but she felt it deep within her bones. The void she had fallen into wasn't empty. It had contained something else, something far worse: memories. Her memories. The others' memories. And not just their memories, but something darker, older, more primal, lurking beneath them. Ava glanced around. The space she now found herself in was different from anything she had encountered before. The metallic, cold walls had disappeared, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating darkness. The air felt thick, as though the atmosphere itself was pressing against her skin, making it harder to breathe. And yet, there was something more. She could hear the faintest sound in the distance, a whisper, or perhaps a voice, too soft to distinguish. But it was there, scratching at the edges of her mind, urging her to listen, to understand. The maze had shifted again, but this time it was not simply a maze of corridors. It was a labyrinth of memories. Where are we? Raj's voice cut through the silence, trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. Ava turned to him, but his face seemed distant, clouded, as if he too were struggling to understand the surreal nature of their surroundings. "I don't know," Ava answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we're not alone." The others looked at her with wide, panicked eyes, as if they too could feel the weight of something watching them. Something old, something alive. Elena, her face gaunt and drained of color, stepped forward. "What do you mean by that? Who's here?" Ava couldn't answer immediately, but something gnawed at her mind. Something about the darkness felt familiar, as if she had been here before, had experienced this before. And then it hit her. It wasn't just the maze she was being confronted with. It was her own past, her own fears, locked away in the deepest recesses of her mind, now given form and substance. She had known this all along, but the weight of it hadn't truly hit her until now. The maze, the creature, the pulse, they weren't separate entities. They were reflections of something much deeper, something buried within each of them, drawing strength from their shared fear and their unresolved trauma. Ava felt her heart skip a beat as she realized the truth. The maze was more than just a test of survival. It was a crucible, a place designed to force them to confront the darkest corners of their minds. And they had no choice but to face it. "I don't know how to explain this," she said slowly, feeling the words forming in her mind before they left her mouth. "But I think the maze is connected to everything we've been through, to all the things we've tried to forget." Raj's eyes widened. "You mean like the things we've done? The people we've hurt?" Ava shook her head. "Not just that. It's not just about guilt or mistakes. It's about the fear that's inside us all. The fear we carry with us, without even realizing it. The maze, it feeds off that." Luis stood motionless, his eyes scanning the dark space, as if he could sense something lurking just beyond his sight. "So it's using us?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Like we're the source of its power?" Elena nodded, a look of grim understanding crossing her face. "And what happens when it gets everything? When it feeds off us completely?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the group fell silent. Ava wanted to deny the possibility, to reject the idea that the maze could truly consume them, but deep down, she knew it was more than possible. It was a terrifying reality. They had all entered this nightmare in search of something. Answers, escape, perhaps even redemption. But now, as they stood in this dark, oppressive space, Ava realized that the only way out was to face what they had buried within themselves, to confront the fear and the pain that had brought them here in the first place. They began to move again, their steps uncertain, hesitant. The whispering voices grew louder, swirling around them, pushing against their consciousness like an invisible force. The shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, twisting and shifting, taking on forms that seemed almost recognizable. Each step they took seemed to trigger something within the labyrinth, a memory, a fleeting image from the past. They could hear snippets of conversations, voices from years ago, familiar faces that they had long since forgotten. Ava's mind raced as she struggled to make sense of it all. What was the maze trying to show them? Why had it chosen them, out of all the people in the world, to be trapped in its twisted embrace? She remembered her own struggles, her past mistakes, her fears, the trauma she had hidden away, and she couldn't help but wonder if the others were experiencing the same thing. Were they reliving their own nightmares, their own unresolved demons? Then, just as she was beginning to understand, the whispering stopped. The air grew unnaturally still. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the shadows that had been clinging to the walls suddenly began to retreat, pulling away like a curtain being drawn back. And in that moment, Ava realized with a sickening certainty that the maze had only been showing them the surface. What lay beneath was far worse. From the depths of the void, a shape emerged, a towering figure, cloaked in darkness, its form barely discernible, its presence suffocating. It was not the creature they had encountered before, but something else, something far more ancient, more powerful. Its eyes glowed like twin embers in the blackness, and as it took a step forward, the very air seemed to warp around it. And then, in a voice that resonated through the very fabric of the maze, it spoke. "You cannot escape yourselves." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. They were not just trapped in the maze. They were trapped in their own minds, facing the monsters they had created. There was no way out, not unless they were willing to face the fear that had brought them here. And in that moment, as the figure loomed closer, Ava understood something else. This was not just a test of survival. It was a test of their very souls. Would they break under the weight of their own fears, or would they conquer them? The answer, she knew, would determine whether they lived or died. The creature's growl echoed through the maze once more, and with it came the realization that they had already begun the final test. But it was a test they could not run from. It was one they had to face, no matter the cost. The figure that loomed before Ava and her group was more than just a mere presence. It was an embodiment of every fear they had ever carried, every shadow that had followed them throughout their lives. As it drew closer, the air around them became stifling, thick with a sense of inevitability. Ava could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her breath shallow, yet her mind was strangely clear. This was it. They were no longer merely running from the maze or the creature. They were running from themselves. The creature's eyes burned like two molten embers, but they weren't just looking at them. They were staring into them. Ava's body trembled as she felt her memories flood to the surface, unbidden and unwelcome. Her past mistakes, her regrets, her fears, they all collided, rushing to the forefront of her mind. It wasn't just her past that was being laid bare. The others were experiencing the same thing. Each of them stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror as their own personal demons rose to meet them. "I told you," the creature's voice rumbled, the sound reverberating through the walls of the maze. It was deep, hollow, and impossibly ancient. "You cannot escape yourselves." Ava wanted to scream, to deny the creature's words, but the truth of them hung heavily in the air. They had been trapped in this place not by some external force, but by their own inner turmoil. The maze was just a manifestation of that turmoil, a prison built from their own guilt and fears. But how could they confront it? How could they fight against something that was so deeply woven into the very fabric of who they were? Raj's voice broke through the suffocating silence, his words strained with desperation. "We don't have to do this. We can still leave. We just need to." "You cannot leave," the creature interrupted, its voice sharper now, like the crack of a whip. "Not unless you face what lies within you." Ava's stomach churned. She had no idea what the creature meant by that. She didn't want to know. She had spent so long hiding from the parts of herself she couldn't bear to face. And now, it seemed, there was no choice but to confront them head-on. Luis stepped forward, his face set in determination. "Then let's face it. We can't keep running." But as he spoke, the shadows in the corners of the maze seemed to stir, as if in response to his words. The ground trembled, and the walls seemed to close in tighter. Ava could hear the faint whispers again, but they weren't just voices. They were fragments of her own thoughts, her own fears, each one amplified by the maze's presence. The walls were not just physical, they were emotional, psychological, and they were closing in on them. Ava closed her eyes, her mind spinning. She couldn't ignore the fear that coursed through her veins, but she had to try. The only way out was through. She thought of the others, each of them standing at their own crossroads, faced with their own monsters. If they couldn't face those monsters together, they would never make it out alive. And she wasn't about to let that happen. "Listen to me," Ava said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to face our fear. All of us. We can't keep pretending that this isn't real. We have to confront it." Elena shook her head, her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. "But how? How do we fight something like this?" Ava didn't have an answer. The creature's presence alone was enough to paralyze anyone with fear. But they had no choice. The maze wasn't just a physical space. It was an extension of their minds, of their deepest anxieties. And until they could confront those, they would remain trapped. "Think about it," Ava continued. "Every one of us has something we've been running from, something we've buried deep down. The maze is making us face it. And if we don't confront it now, we'll never get out." Raj looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the realization. He had always been the one to crack jokes, to deflect the serious moments with humor, but now he seemed to shrink in on himself. He was no longer the carefree man they had known. He was a person broken, torn by his own hidden fears. The creature's laughter echoed through the maze, low and menacing. "It's too late. You've already failed." But in that moment, something clicked in Ava's mind. She realized that the creature's words were only another part of the trap. It wanted them to give up. It wanted them to believe that they had already lost. But she wasn't going to let it win. "Ignore it," she said, her voice more confident now. "We're not giving up. We're not going to let this thing control us." Elena, Raj, and Luis exchanged uncertain glances, but there was a glimmer of understanding in their eyes. The creature might have control over their surroundings, but it didn't have control over them. Not unless they allowed it. And so, with a shared breath, they turned to face their fear. Each of them took a step forward, their hearts pounding, their minds flooded with memories they had long buried. The walls of the maze began to warp, to shift, as their pasts collided with the present. But they didn't retreat. They stood firm. Ava felt the creature's gaze pierce into her, its eyes burning with unspoken promises of destruction. But she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time since they entered the maze, she understood. The creature wasn't their enemy. It was a reflection of their own weakness, their own inability to confront the truth. The real enemy was within them, and only by facing that could they break free. The maze shifted once again, but this time the changes felt different. The shadows didn't seem as oppressive. The whispers, though still present, were no longer filled with malice. The walls themselves seemed to tremble, as if they were afraid of what the group was beginning to understand. "Face it," the creature said, its voice growing faint. "You will never escape until you do." But Ava didn't need its permission. She had already won. The others had already won. Together, they had taken the first step in confronting their fears. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the maze was no longer a place of terror. It was a place of possibility, a chance to break free from the past and the fears that had kept them trapped. The creature, the maze, the terror, it was all starting to fade. But Ava knew this was just the beginning. The real battle had only just begun. The maze quaked violently as the group stood firm, their collective resolve pushing back against the entity's oppressive presence. The once solid walls now shimmered like water disturbed by a thrown stone, and the air grew thick with the sound of cracking stone and distant, tortured screams. Ava, Luis, Elena, and Raj exchanged glances, their faces pale but determined. Whatever they had triggered, it wasn't over yet. It was only escalating. "Is it breaking apart?" Luis asked, his voice almost lost in the cacophony around them. His question hung unanswered as the ground beneath them shifted, tilting and groaning as if the very foundation of the maze was unraveling. "No," Ava said, clutching the side of the wall to steady herself. Her voice was steady despite the chaos. "It's fighting back. It's not going to let us go without a final test." The maze shifted violently, disorienting them as the walls dissolved into jagged edges that reassembled themselves in unfamiliar configurations. The group was forced apart, each person thrust into their own isolated path, surrounded by the suffocating dark. Ava's cries for the others went unanswered as she stumbled forward, the flickering torches extinguishing one by one, plunging her into an abyss. For Ava, the solitude felt like a vice tightening around her chest. The shadows were alive with the echo of whispered doubts and accusations, growing louder with every step she took. You think you've won? The voices taunted. You've only scratched the surface. Her memories assaulted her. Moments of failure, of selfishness, of every time she had chosen the easier path instead of the right one. She knew she had to press on, but each step was heavier than the last. Elena found herself in a corridor lined with mirrors, each one reflecting distorted, horrifying versions of herself. In one, her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. In another, she was covered in blood, a feral grin stretching her face. "This isn't real," she whispered, but the reflections began to speak, their voices overlapping in a cacophony. "You're weak, Elena. You've always been weak. You think you can lead anyone? You can't even lead yourself." Her hands trembled as she reached out, shattering the nearest mirror. The shards rained down, each one glinting with malevolent light. But instead of despair, something inside her hardened. "No," she said firmly. "Not anymore." Meanwhile, Luis's path was consumed by fire, the flames licking at his heels as he ran. The heat was unbearable, and the air was thick with smoke that stung his eyes and lungs. But the flames weren't just fire. They were memories. His childhood home burning after his careless mistake, his father's disappointed gaze, his sister's voice crying for help. "You can't save them," the flames whispered. "You couldn't then, and you can't now." But Luis stopped running. He turned to face the fire, sweat streaming down his face, and shouted, "Maybe I can't, but I'm done running from it." Raj's trial was silence. Utter, consuming silence. He wandered through an endless expanse of white nothingness, his thoughts echoing back at him. "You've always been the clown, the distraction. Do you even know who you are without the jokes?" He tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. It was true. He had used humor as a shield, as a way to keep people at arm's length. But now, there was no one to laugh for. Just him and the truth. For the first time, Raj allowed himself to feel the weight of his sadness, and it didn't destroy him. Instead, it settled over him like a cloak, comforting in its honesty. Time passed differently for each of them, but one by one, they emerged from their trials, stepping back into the central chamber of the maze. They were battered, exhausted, and covered in dirt and sweat, but there was a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Ava was the last to arrive, her face streaked with tears, but she stood taller, stronger. The creature was waiting for them, its form shifting and flickering as if it struggled to maintain its shape. Its glowing eyes burned brighter than ever, but there was a hesitation in its stance, a faltering that hadn't been there before. "You think this changes anything?" It snarled, its voice a low growl. "You may have faced your past, but you are still mine." "No," Ava said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We were never yours. You only had power over us because we let you. But not anymore." The creature roared, a sound that shook the walls and sent cracks spidering through the ground beneath their feet. But the group didn't flinch. They stood together, united in a way they hadn't been before. And as the creature lunged toward them, they didn't retreat. They stepped forward. The maze began to crumble, its walls collapsing inward as the creature dissolved into a cloud of black smoke, its screams fading into the void. The ground beneath their feet gave way, and for a moment, they were falling, tumbling through the dark. But instead of fear, they felt something else: freedom. When they landed, it wasn't in the maze. It was on the grass outside, under the clear night sky. The stars were brighter than they had ever seen, and the air was cool and fresh. They looked at each other, their faces lit by the moonlight, and for the first time, they smiled. The maze was gone, and so was the creature. But the lessons it had forced upon them remained. They weren't the same people who had entered that cursed place. They were stronger now, not because they had defeated the maze, but because they had faced themselves and survived. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the group as they stood outside the remnants of the maze. Their freedom should have brought a sense of closure, but an unsettling tension lingered in the air, as if the maze had left an invisible mark on the night. Ava, Luis, Elena, and Raj exchanged wary glances, their triumph tempered by the nagging feeling that their ordeal wasn't truly over. "We're out," Raj said, his voice hollow despite the relief that should have come with those words. "So, why doesn't it feel like we've won?" Ava turned to him, her eyes searching the darkness around them. "Because this isn't over," she said quietly. "The maze is gone, but something isn't right. I can feel it." Luis knelt on the ground, running his fingers through the grass. "This doesn't feel real," he muttered, "like we've traded one illusion for another." Elena, always the pragmatist, folded her arms and surveyed their surroundings. The field stretched endlessly in all directions, the skyline of Los Angeles conspicuously absent. Instead, a dense forest loomed on the horizon, its dark trees swaying ominously despite the absence of wind. "We're not in LA anymore," she said flatly. "Wherever we are, it's not where we started." The realization hit them like a thunderclap. The maze had spit them out, but not into the world they had known. The stars above seemed foreign, unfamiliar constellations winking down as if mocking their confusion. Raj broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Great. We beat the maze only to end up in what? A pocket dimension? A cursed forest? Someone's nightmare?" As they debated their next move, the sound of crunching leaves interrupted them. A figure emerged from the shadows of the forest, moving with a deliberate slowness that sent chills down their spines. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. He was dressed in tattered, outdated clothing, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes, however, burned with a strange intensity that seemed to pierce through the group. "Congratulations," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "Few escape the maze. Even fewer survive what comes next." "What comes next?" Ava demanded, stepping forward. Despite her fear, she held her ground, her voice steady. "What is this place? Who are you?" The man tilted his head, regarding her with something akin to pity. "You've been marked," he said simply. "The maze is only the beginning. It finds those who are fractured, those who carry pain, and forces them to face it. But the cost of survival is steep. You've seen the cracks in your reality. Now, they'll only grow." Luis clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "What are you talking about? We escaped. We beat it." The man smiled faintly, though the gesture carried no warmth. "You escaped one layer of the trap, but the maze never truly lets go. It's bound to you now, stitched into your souls. And soon, it will pull you back, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words pressing down on them like a physical force. Ava's mind raced, searching for a way to refute his claims, but deep down, she felt the truth in them. The maze wasn't gone. It was dormant, waiting to resurface. As the man turned to leave, Raj called out, desperation lacing his voice. "Wait! How do we stop it? How do we break free?" The man paused, his back to them. For a moment, it seemed he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "To end the maze, you must return to its heart. But be warned, this time, it won't let you leave." Before they could respond, the man vanished into the forest, his form dissolving into the shadows as if he had never been there. The group stood in the stillness, the enormity of their situation sinking in. The maze had never truly ended. It had only shifted, adapting to trap them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Ava turned to the others, her jaw set in determination. "If going back is the only way to end this, then that's what we'll do. We've come this far. We're not stopping now." Elena nodded, her gaze hardening. "Whatever it takes. We can't let this thing win." Raj and Luis exchanged a glance, their fear evident but outweighed by their resolve. Together, they began walking toward the forest, their steps unsteady but purposeful. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the trees whispering secrets they couldn't yet understand. They didn't know what awaited them in the heart of the maze, but one thing was certain: they wouldn't face it alone. The forest was alive with an unnatural energy, the trees twisting and bending as if they were conscious observers of the group's journey. The air thickened with each step Ava, Luis, Elena, and Raj took, the weight of the maze's curse pressing down on them. They had crossed into a realm beyond reason, where reality itself seemed fluid. The heart of the maze was close, its pull unmistakable, but with every stride, the dread grew deeper, the silence heavier. As they moved forward, the trees began to part, revealing an open clearing. At its center stood a massive mirror, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. The mirror emitted an otherworldly glow, pulsating in sync with their own anxious heartbeats. Ava approached cautiously, her reflection shifting unnaturally as she drew nearer. Her face, fractured and distorted in the glass, stared back at her with a mix of defiance and terror. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The heart of the maze." The group circled the mirror, their own reflections warping and twisting with each movement. Unlike an ordinary mirror, this one didn't merely reflect their appearances. It exposed their fears, their regrets, their secrets. Raj froze as his reflection turned to face him directly, its eyes void of pupils, and whispered words he couldn't hear but understood in his bones. Elena's reflection showed her covered in ash, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the glass. Luis clenched his fists, his reflection showing him kneeling, defeated, surrounded by shadowy figures. "It's feeding on us," Luis said through gritted teeth. "On everything we've tried to leave behind." Ava turned to the group, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her. "This is the maze's power. It's why it never lets go. We have to break it, destroy it before it takes us completely." "But how?" Elena asked, her reflection now pounding on the glass, as if trying to escape. The answer came not from Ava, but from the mirror itself. The liquid surface rippled and split, revealing a vortex of swirling light and shadow. A voice emanated from within, deep and resonant, echoing across the clearing. "To break the maze," it said, "you must surrender yourselves. Only in sacrifice can you sever its hold. One must stay behind." The group recoiled at the pronouncement. The weight of the words hung heavy, each of them understanding the gravity of the choice. To destroy the maze, one of them would have to remain trapped within it forever. Raj shook his head, stepping back. "No, there has to be another way. We've come too far to leave anyone behind." Ava, however, remained still, her mind racing. She thought of the lives they'd led before the maze, the people they could become if they escaped its grip. This was more than just survival. It was about freedom, not just for them, but for anyone the maze might ensnare in the future. Someone had to end the cycle. "I'll do it," Ava said, her voice steady. The others turned to her in shock, voices overlapping in protest, but Ava raised her hand, silencing them. "This thing has taken enough from us. It's time for someone to take a stand. If staying behind means ending it for good, then that's what I'll do." Luis stepped forward, shaking his head. "No, Ava. We'll find another way. We always do." But Ava's expression was resolute. "We don't have time to search for another way. This ends now." She stepped toward the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with a mix of sadness and resolve. As her fingers touched the surface, the glass rippled like water, and a cold, piercing energy surged through her. The vortex grew brighter, its pull intensifying, and the ground beneath them trembled. "Thank you," the voice from the mirror said, now softer, almost tender. "The maze will crumble. You are its final offering." Before anyone could stop her, Ava stepped through the glass, her form dissolving into the swirling light. The vortex collapsed behind her, the mirror shattering into a million shards. The forest around them began to dissolve, the trees fading into wisps of smoke as the maze disintegrated. Luis, Elena, and Raj found themselves standing back in Los Angeles on a quiet, empty street. The air was still, the night eerily calm. She did it, Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. She ended it. Luis dropped to his knees, staring at the ground where Ava had been moments ago. The weight of her sacrifice was overwhelming, but so was the sense of liberation. The maze was gone. The curse had been broken, yet the cost was undeniable. Raj placed a hand on Luis's shoulder, his voice heavy with emotion. "We'll honor her, Luis. We'll make sure no one forgets what she did for us." As they stood together, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the city in golden light. It was a new day, free from the maze's grip, but Ava's absence was a shadow that would linger in their hearts forever.